Fractured. Loyalties. N. Chapter 1. N. Far to the north of the common pine grove that boomed in green, beyond the muddy creek that carried whispers from the mystical Appalachian hills, stood a modest house, home to the Callahan brothers. Nathaniel, or Nate, as I like to call him, stood 2 springs older than my tender 14 years. Still a boy in the eyes of the world, but perceived as a man by the hardened realities of our southern land. The house wore an old, weary look, with ivy creeping over its hewn oak panels in summer, and the crimson leaves clinging to its straw-thatched roof in fall. Yet, this seemingly desolate house was rich with the overtures of laughter, the warmth of kinship, and the harmonious silence shared between Nate and me. It was rich with being home. Nate was more than merely a brother to me. He was my guide, my compatriot, my role model. I admired his resolute gaze fixed unflinchingly upon the star-pinned southern sky. The way he held his chin high as if the weight of our dreams rested thereon. We shared a bond, a pact almost as sacred as the oath of loyalty, duty, and honor pledged to our homeland of South Carolina and the gallant Confederate cause we idealized. Every morning, the sun's rays pierced through the mist, casting an ethereal glow over the dew-kissed meadows that marked our playing grounds. Nate was my ally in the myriad adventures that unfolded. We built lofty castles of hay, waged wars against menacing shadows, and galloped over the hide of the grassy knolls, dreaming of the day our arms would be strong enough to wield a sword and our hearts brave enough to march into the uncharted territories of war. "Look, Eli," Nate would say, his finger tracing the invisible lines that connected the stars in the vast, boundless sky. "Those are the great soldiers of the past looking down upon us, urging us to continue their legacy. We'll fight for the South, like father and his father before him." The stars twinkled back, silently illuminating our dreams sown in the heart of the southern soil. One evening, as the sky painted itself a fiery orange and the whispering pines cast a sleepy shadow over our house, Nate and I were sitting on the sturdy wooden steps of our porch. The cool breeze carried with it an unfamiliar air, the air of a brewing storm. With my head resting on Nate's shoulder and our hearts humming a symphony of dreams and possibilities, we watched the inklings of a changing world rid across the horizon. "I've been thinking, Eli," Nate's voice, hushed and contemplative, broke the serene silence that wrapped us. "About what?" I asked, tracing patterns into the wooden grain of the steps. "About what we'll do if war comes. If the Union doesn't see reason, we'll have to step up, fight for our homeland, for our rights," he said, a glint of determination flickering in his hazel eyes under the dim light. I swallowed the uneasy lump in my throat. "I'd follow you anywhere, Nate," I uttered, my voice barely a whisper. I meant it, despite the unmentioned fear clotting my insides. The fear of war and the unflinching, heavy hand of destiny. We were Callahans, born to protect our legacy, our homeland, our South. Our days were filled with the robust chants of Southern pride as we worked in Mrs. Hathaway's bakery downtown, earning a handful of pennies and more than a handful of Mrs. Hathaway's sugary cinnamon rolls. Even as the tightening knots of uncertainty tugged at our hearts, the thrumming pulse of Southern pride was stronger. One early summer night, on our way back home from downtown, the air filled with anxious whispers and fearful gasps. The crackling beats of war drums from afar echoed in our ears. And as we watched in the unsteady torchlight, the grim proclamation was made, dusting the silence away. The Union had declared war on our Confederacy. Our gaze turned upon each other. It was time, the moment we had been waiting for. Fiercely. Still, not all dreams that come true bring elation. Some bring pain, untold and heavy. In that profound moment, we were two silhouettes etched against a backdrop scarred by war and uncertainty. We departed from our childhood fortress and rode on the winds steered by destiny, embarking on a journey toward possibilities neither of us could envision. Undeterred, we marched onward, armed with valor and burning dreams, towards the frontier of the impending war, now our battlefield. That night, beneath the veil of the inky sky, we made a solemn promise. A pledge that echoed louder than our quiet voices lost amidst the cacophonous whispers of war. It was a promise that tied our fates intertwined tighter than ever. A cord that bound us stronger than the blood we shared. We're in this together, Eli. Nate's voice rang into the night, his gaze lit with the fire of resolution. Always. Nate, I echoed, the unyielding spirit of a Callahan reverberating in my voice, even as the winds of fate threatened to whisk us in different directions. I knew, deep within my heart, nothing would separate us, for we were Nathaniel and Eli Callahan, brothers not just by birth but by dreams, by pride, and the indomitable bond that tied us together. Inseparable. Dreaming of the dawn we would bring to our southern land, we ventured forth, not knowing that dawn was farther than we thought. Farther and costlier. But such is the great wheel of destiny. Forever moving. Forever changing. Revealing paths we never knew existed. Leading us towards truths we never were ready to accept. The journey had only just begun. N. Chapter 2. N. The sun rose in a hurried, humid haze, and the world woke to another day. The cribbed sheet metal crowing echoed through the air, piercing the stillness of the early morning as I dragged myself from the old creaky bed. Nate was already up, his bed empty. The straw mattress rolled away. I picked up my worn work boots lying askew on the uneven wooden floor, dusted them a bit, and tugged them on. As I stepped out onto the porch, Nate was there, chopping firewood with a fierceness that hadn't been there the week before. A forced normalcy hung in the air between us, a silent acknowledgement of the life we had known that was no more. We were going to war. Our days turned into tedious rituals, each action a distraction from the impending reality. Nate became quieter, his usually warm hazel eyes clouded with a mix of determination and concern. Discussions on war stratagems replaced our banter, and our laughter was slowly drowned by the thunderous clouds of war looming on our horizon. One sweltering afternoon, I watched Nate help our old neighbor, Mr. Jackson, fix his weather-beaten fence. Beads of sweat rolled down his forehead, further darkening the earth under him, and he tightened his grip on the hammer, bouncing it off the nail with a resounding echo. His gaze didn't falter, his concentration unyielding. He looked like a soldier. No, he was a soldier, determined to set things right by his own hands. War will make a man out of you, Eli, he'd said on a night cloaked in the mellow moonlight. Father always said, to protect those who you love costs a part of you. You have to be willing to weather those storms. And weather we did, each passing moment stretching into an infinite timeline. Every tick of the clock an invasive reminder of our changing fate. We were not merely living under the sun anymore. We were now living under the shadow of war. A reality we sought. A reality far grimmer than the idealized battles we used to envision. The reality doesn't just change the world outside. It changes what's within. And within us brewed a storm. Each gust of wind navigating us towards our destiny. The day I chose to defy my brother's warnings was no different from the previous ones. Humid and heavy. There was no dramatic shift in the weather or any ominous sign cursing the day. But I was restless, my heart pounding like a war drum, the blood pulsing in my veins louder than the chirping cicadas. I, too, wanted to be a part of this new world order. With Nate away helping Mr. Eastwood with his harvest, It felt like a blank canvas to etch my mark. I remember convincing myself, my words falling onto my conscience like soft rain. You're a Callahan. Eli. You've heard the war stories. Watched the soldiers march. Cheered for them every time they passed by the bakery. It's time you stop watching from the sidelines. Be the man in the picture. I set out that afternoon, my heart echoing my determination, and my head riffing on 1,000 scenarios. Amidst the chattel of men and cannons at the town square, I slipped in unnoticed. Men, some just boys like me, shoulders squared, heads held high, were bidding goodbye to tear-stricken families. The heart-rending scene doused my spirits somewhat, but I held on to my resolute will, my eyes searching for my place amongst them. Rivulets of sweat careened down my face, and my throat lumped up at the sight of families waving their boys away. Yet, I pushed forth, marched into the sea of unknown faces, familiar only in their dreams which mirrored mine, defending their homeland. Hell or glory, whatever awaited us, we were here to meet it, face to face, dredged up from the same southern soil we swore to protect. I ventured deep into the battle line, my heart thudding against my ribs in a manic percussion. The air grew thick with nervous excitement, uncertainty, and fear masked by foolhardy bravado. Amid the bustling throng of soldiers, my eyes fell on a huddled group discussing the Confederacy's plan of defense. Their blueprints spread out on an old maple wood table. Their leader, a man in his mid-40s with remnants of youthful vigor in his stance, looked over the plans. His eyes, though, masked a storm that had seen many winters and carried the weight of the world. A world embroiled in chaos and war. Fired with naive curiosity, I shadowed the group, careful to blend in, listening to the stories of frontline skirmishes and hard-fought victories. The sun was slowly dipping to seed the sky to dusk as I scuttled further into the forbidden battle lines. My foot nudged against an unseen root, and I tumbled down a concealed ditch. My modest attempt at changing my destiny was failing, and rather embarrassingly at that. As I dusted away the earth from my homespun clothes, I shook my head at my own recklessness. Before I could scramble up, a shadow fell over me, extinguishing daylight and replacing it with a creeping tension. A pair of boots appeared in my line of vision, and a metallic blue rendition of my reflection stared back at me from polished Western style cavalry boots. Slowly, my gaze traveled upwards, past the column of neatly pressed blue uniform to the stern face of a Union soldier. His eyes bore a certain quietness, a mirror showing a man who had weathered the brunt of war with a harsh resignation. His hand went to his holstered rifle, and a simple truth struck me with the force of his gaze. I had just been captured by the enemy. That night, sitting in their makeshift prison under the world's silent vigil, I wondered if I was ready to pay the price of my impulsive bravery. I was indeed a Callahan, and like my ancestors before me, I was now a soldier, a prisoner of war. The new reality clutched my heart in its icy grip. Little did I know, it was just the first knock from destiny, a beckoning call for a journey much more profound, a journey that would shatter the illusions of my glory, only to rebuild a reality unimagined by a 14-year-old me. N. Chapter 3. N. The red-brown soil beneath my back was icy cold compared to the uncomfortable warmth emanating from the fringed woolen blanket that the Union soldiers had carelessly thrown over me. The makeshift dungeon was packed with captured lads like me, Southern boys with their eyes ignited with the fearless flame of protecting the sacred lands of their birth. "What is your name, lad?" A gruff voice penetrated the whirl of 1,000 thoughts caught in a tumultuous steeplechase. Within me, I turned to find a middle-aged Union soldier crouching beside me, a phantom under the room's shadowy recesses. his face partially hidden beneath the curled brim of his navy blue cap. Eli. Sir. Eli Callahan. I stammered out the words, my voice shriller than I had hoped. I immediately kicked myself for showing weakness. I was a soldier, a prisoner of war, and I needed to act tough even if my insides were twisting into knots. Eli, he repeated my name as if savoring the distinct unfamiliarity. His eyes were pools of calm blue-gray, storm-battered oceans that held a sadness much deeper than my understanding. Friendly fire. Eh? Rambled into enemy territory out of curiosity. Quote. His words hung in the oppressive silence that had swallowed the room. No, sir, it wasn't curiosity. I hesitated for a moment before my words skittered out, the defiant resonance reverberating off the cold stone walls. I wanted to be part of it. I was tired of being on the sidelines. He was taken aback by my confession, a glimmer of amusement flickering in his weary eyes. Not many 14-year-olds want to walk right into the heart of a war. Eli, he murmured, an odd admiration lingering in his words. His statement stirred a particular warmth within me, a sense of validation. I nodded, daring to meet his gaze. I am not like many 14-year-olds. Sir. Laughter rumbled deep within his chest. A dry, rusty sound that spoke of days when joy was not rationed, and laughter was not a luxury but a mere expression of delight. And even though I didn't find the humor in my proclamation, his laughter was infectious, trickling warmth into the ice-cold shell war had encased around my heart. He introduced himself as General Reginald Hughes of the Union Army. For the first time since my capture, I didn't feel alone, helplessly adrift in a vast sea of implacable faces. I had made an ally in enemy territory. If war taught me anything so far, it was that heroes and villains were not a binary concept but were distinguished by circumstances and perspectives. War is a cruel teacher. Eli, General Hughes would often say, his gaze far lost in the recollections of a life that lay on the other side of this chaos. You don't win in a war. You merely survive, holding on to the last strands of your humanity. I spent my days working off my captivity with the hard labor assigned and my nights listening to Hughes and absorbing his wisdom. His fascinating tales of the North began sketching a different world beyond the borders of South Carolina. A world far from the monstrous image painted by our Southern folktales. Heated debates replaced bleak silences. The spring of my newfound camaraderie with General Hughes bloomed in the incessant winter of war. In this brave soldier who wore the blue uniform and bore the Northern Cross on his shapely shoulders, I found a mentor. Guided by my candid admiration and youthful defiance, Hughes began to respect my views. The Southern lad who was more than a mere prisoner eager to prove his allegiance to his homeland. It was during an intense conversation about the Union's principles of anti-slavery when he finally addressed my thoughts with a profound question. Do you not regard all men as equal, Eli? Quote. I bit back my preconceived notions, contemplating the ideals I was bred on, religion, and my place within it all. I'm not sure, sir, I finally admitted, my voice barely a whisper, each word leaving a bitter aftertaste. It was the first time I had confessed my insecurities, the inward battle between the inherited beliefs and the burgeoning realization of their skewed reality. Hughes didn't respond. He merely nodded, his gaze ambiguous, equally filled with condolence and respect. That was your most honest answer, Eli, he said, patting my back, his touch bringing solace to my tumultuous thoughts. During my captivity under the Union soldiers, I learned more about the world beyond my southern hometown, about life, courage, and the ambiguous notions of right and wrong. The blue uniform no longer seemed the enemy. They were men, after all, fighting for what they believed in, just like us. As the days rolled into months, I began to see my captors in a different light. They were men, much like me. They, too, held on to their dreams, loves, and loathed the battleground just as much, but fought nonetheless, obliged by their fervor for their northern homeland. The enemy lines began to blur, and a singular truth emerged from the dense fog of my captivity. I was turning into a part of the Union's cause. Little did I know, it was only the beginning of a seismic shift rattling the foundations of the life I once had. The beliefs I once harbored. War had initially seemed like an illustrious canvas of heroic tales and formidable knights, shimmering with the golden glory of love for my homeland. But underneath the northern blue cap, amidst the soldiers I once pictured as enemies, I was beginning to understand the brutal reality. Having lived within the enigmatic shades of blue, behind the barbed wires of enemy lines, I had perhaps discovered more about myself and my place within this grand world than I could ever have amidst the familiarity of my southern home. Weeks turned into months, and leaves turned golden, then crispy brown, carried away by the biting winter winds. My southern tan faded, replaced by a paleness reflecting the unforgiving northern chill. Night after night, as I sat sharing stories and singing songs of the forgotten peace with Hughes and my fellow inmates, I felt an unsettling comfort envelop me. I was a Confederate soldier enveloped in the world of the Union's blue. My new life was a testament to the key lesson of Hughes, that no side in a war is entirely righteous or pure evil. The morality of war was a question of perspective. His influence seeped into me like rainwater into parched earth, silently shaking the truths I had held on to so dearly till this point. The war was not a battle of North versus South. It was not the simplistic rivalry thwarted from the storybooks of knights and kings. It was tradition versus progress, old ideas versus new, and man's undeniable right to freedom against another man's instinctual dominance. Themes that mirrored across all impending battles. One crisp October evening, as the sun began to dip under the blanket of autumn foliage, General Hughes approached me, a familiar heaviness in his gaze. "Eli, there is more to your journey, son," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder, the intimacy in his voice taking me by surprise. It was the first time he had called me son, a revelation that maybe, just maybe, I was earning his respect. I was no longer just Eli Callahan, the Southern lad drawn into the pulsating heart of the Northern Army. I was Eli Callahan, the soldier learning to distinguish between filial loyalty and an inevitable awakening gnawing at his conscience. I was a prisoner of war, a student of life, garnering wisdom under the backdrop of falling bullets and rising smoke. Chapter 4. The air was decidedly chill, a restless foreboding that heralded the relentless snowstorms known to sweep the Northern Territory. It was my first winter in the Union's captivity, the biting cold failing to numb the startling revelations gaining root within me. Despite my shade of blue not matching my comrades, the Union had accepted me, shared their spoils, fought by my side in the trenches of self-discovery and notable loss. I even had a father figure, a man named General Hughes, and a mentor who raised questions that unsettled the fragile peace of my Southern upbringings. Up until that point in my life, the bulk of my understanding of ethics and principles had remained tethered to the teachings of my parents, of Nathaniel, of my entire community. Their teachings were steeped in loyalty to the South and its traditions. But these month-long interactions with the Union, especially under Hughes' steadfast mentorship, drastically infected my paradigm. "Eli," Hughes beckoned me one evening. We were sitting across each other, the flickering fire between us throwing our shadows across the blanketed fort. "These chains of captivity are mere iron. They don't hold the power to bind your understanding, your evolution. They're not the enemy. His words knotted my stomach. But the truth was there, naked and glaring. No, it was true. The enemy was not the chains. It was the notion that there could solely be one truth, one loyalty, one understanding of right and wrong. Over time, the Union soldiers had become something close to friends while the once foe turned mentor, General Hughes, turned out to be the best friend I never knew I needed. Removing the veils of contentious politics, we were just soldiers, trapped within the gears of an unwieldy war, fumbling on the path of loyalty and survival. You told me once that you'd willingly risk everything to fight for your homeland, an admirable sentiment. Young Eli, Hughes' voice was hushed as he studied the ashen wood in the fire pit thoughtfully. But have you ever wondered, what if the cause that you were ready to risk everything for? What if it's flawed? Are you merely a young man seduced into a patriotic maelstrom? Quote, a jarring quiet fell across the confines of his tent. The fire crackled obnoxiously, illuminating the runes of truth etched into his words. Resonating within me, they stirred a bunch of constricting sentiments that I had been grappling with these past weeks. Hughes' questions weren't accusations. Far from it. They were a pathway to liberation. A clarion call to question the supposed facts I had accepted without suspicion. Faced with his wisdom and sincerity, even the deep-rooted allegiance to my homeland faded into the background, replaced by the insatiable thirst to excavate the truth buried beneath shackles of misguided loyalty. Days faded into weeks, each one adding a newfound understanding and appreciation of the Union's determination. I found a slice of respect for the enemy I had been indoctrinated to loathe. Reflections of bravery beneath the blue uniforms that mirrored our own. Echoes of the same love for homeland, albeit a different piece of the land. One day, to my utter surprise, it dawned upon me that I no longer felt captive about wearing the blue uniform. It was no longer a mark of my capture or a blatant symbol of my betrayal to the Southern cause. Instead, I began to see it as an emblem, a testament to the transformative journey that had led me to reevaluate my convictions, to challenge the biases I had grown on. With a heavy heart, I stripped away my Confederate gray, the fabric rough against my fingertips, memories clinging to its worn threads like morning dew on cobwebs. My eyes lingeringly scanned the room. The humid warmth swaddled around the comforting familiarity of what had been my home for the better part of the year, now resonating with the sense of realization and self-discovery. In the middle of the tent was a stack of Union blue uniforms, each carefully folded, the deep blue a vivid reminder of the choice I was inching towards. Gulping down my nervous excitement, I slowly lifted one from the top, feeling its heavy fabric. The blue was a stark contrast to the gray I had known, the former associated with enemy, death, and destruction. But now it signified a transformation, a shift in allegiance, the shift in my worldview. Shivering slightly, I slipped into the new uniform. The cloth beneath my fingertips was cold, strange, but not entirely alien. My heart pounded loudly, echoing across the silent room as I dressed myself up in what used to be enemy colors. The blue felt surprisingly familiar, a feeling of surprising kinship with those whom I considered rivals. As I stepped out of the tent, the new blue fabric rustling against my cold, sunken skin, a wave of unchartered curiosity swept me. I was welcomed subtly but surely. Nods of approval, glimmers of understanding in their eyes. A newfound respect that seemed to resonate across even as I walked into the midst of Union soldiers. Marking the progression of Eli Callahan, a young man lost in the battle of his essence, dressed in a war-worn uniform, marching down a path overridden with crossroads. I was all but a misplaced boy playing hero. But I had clarity now. I recognized the strength to confront the reality of war for what it was, not what my Southern tales painted it to be. I recognized the fortitude required to question my beliefs and the courage embodied in drawing my conclusion. A conclusion untethered from the chains of Southern biases. I knew, as I looked around the room filled with men and women, ready to fight for a cause they believed in, that each one of us was merely assembling a jigsaw puzzle, every piece a unique perspective, a distinctive truth learned through blood, sweat, and tears. There were 1,000 blue uniforms, 1,000 individual lives, 1,000 stories. And amidst them, I found my shade of blue, a reflection of the Southern lad who braved the testing tides and emerged as the Union Blue. My decision was not a question of who was right. The Southern pride of my homeland would forever echo within my heart. But the awareness and empathy I gained during my time with the Union, that was the guiding compass. The duality was not a conflict but an amalgamation. A blend of woeful compromises and earnest brutal realities that drew me to the Union. I was taking a stand, not against my Southern homeland, but for the bigger cause that I had started to believe in just as deeply. After all, as General Hughes had wisely said, in war, it was not about winning, it was about surviving. And it was through my surrendering to a broader perspective that I found my own way of surviving the inevitable tides of this cruel teacher. I was Eli Callahan, a man standing on the crossroads between loyalty and understanding, a Confederate heart wearing a Union's blue. N. Chapter 5. Living and breathing in Union Blue was not nearly as daunting as I'd anticipated. Bear in mind, my uniform was merely a color change. The war was still the same. The enemy was still the same. A growling maw of destruction swallowing the men it could and spitting them out as bullet-riddled, shell-shocked versions of themselves. My first day of Union drilling was accompanied by gregarious bouts of camaraderie and the buzz of excitement, all tainted by underlying tension. Marching shoulder to shoulder with my fellow soldiers, dust uncovered by our synchronized footsteps rose in quiet rebellion, clouding the otherwise white winter air. The familiar call of the bugle in the cold morning, previously an intimidating summon to defense, now felt oddly similar to a rousing cry for action. We lined up, all soldiers in uniform, bathed in an unworldly glow of the rising sun. Despite us being men from different backgrounds, experiences, and dreams, we were finally soldiers of the same battlefield. In the midst of our ranks stood General Hughes, his stern gaze sweeping across the parade ground. It somehow felt different, being part of the formation and not a captured spectator. His broad shoulders were straight, his countenance stern, but beneath the strict exterior, I noted the familiar softness in his eyes. He was not just a general responsible for our training, he was a father figure for his boys in blue, counting on the fragile hope that he would lead them right. Weeks passed in a whirl, each more demanding than the previous one. Rigorous training kicked up a notch. We were introduced to the Union Army's advanced weaponry, significantly different from what I was previously familiar with. Learning to use a breech-loading rifle was not without its challenges. But eventually, I gained a certain level of dexterity. The cold metal as responsive to my touch as a trusted old friend. Endless drills filled our days, with Sergeant Davis barking orders and insisting on precision. We were taught to march, retreat, and charge, practicing until our feet bled. Our muscles screamed in protest, and our minds became as sharp as the bayonets we wielded. Every day, after retiring from the strenuous exertion, we congregated by the smoky fires, nursing blisters and recounting tales from home. I listened to their stories, fascinated by the vast expanse of our dreams and lives converging on the axis of our shared cause. The Union, Despite my allegiance, my heart ached for the once familiar Southern accents and shared memories, replaced now with accents from Massachusetts, Ohio, and Wisconsin. I missed Nate, our late-night shenanigans, and the naivete of old days. Those idyllic moments were now replaced with horrors and the cruelties of war. There was little comfort to be had, but camaraderie held us together, an invisible thread of shared misery and brotherhood. My days in blue accelerated time. Months sounded like mere moments. Each new dawn briskly merged with twilight, the ashen sky our only audience, bearing silent witness to our metamorphosis into courageous and stern-faced soldiers. One of my memorable moments was during a grueling defense drill. We had been training for more than 12 hours in the biting cold. We were all on the edge of exhaustion, the continuous exertion taking a toll. It was my turn at one of the defense positions, and despite my fatigue, I rushed forward. Suddenly, my leg buckled, and I found myself face first in the snow. Peals of laughter erupted. Apparently, watching the new boy fall was entertainment for my comrades tired from the drill. Embarrassment surged through me, and I stumbled to my feet, preparing to charge again. Before I could make a second attempt, a hand gripped my shoulder, halting me. It was General Hughes. He'd been observing us from afar. "Rest, Eli," he said, adding with a twinkle in his eyes. "Remember, it's not about how hard you fall, but largely about how you pick yourself back up." The general, the father, the friend, he was always there, watching over us, guiding us, and sometimes even reprimanding us. His stoic demeanor held a silent promise that he was there and wouldn't let any of us go down. Without a fight, he was the bastion, a lion defending his cubs, a shepherd guarding his flock, a beacon of resilience amidst war's chaos. Our relationship was unique. The general and I, we were the unlikeliest of friends. Given my journey from being a captured enemy to now a soldier in his ranks, our camaraderie was as unusual as it was baffling. There was a newfound trust between us, a shared understanding that cemented our bond. My past life gradually became a hazy dream, losing its edges, the colors bleeding into my new reality, blurring the lines between who I had been and who I was becoming. It didn't matter anymore. My Confederate past didn't define me entirely. I was Eli Callahan, former prisoner of war, aspiring Union solider, the stern general's confidant, and a boy evolving into a man on the brutal grounds of a war-torn nation. Charged with energy and stirred by a shared mission, we drew strength from each other. Strangely, the hardships forged stronger bonds. Snippets of laughter we stole amidst our dire situation felt genuine, and every memory we created knee-deep in snowfall imprinted on our hearts. We were more than just silhouettes in blue uniforms. We were a brotherhood bound by the abiding spirit of resilience and unity against daunting odds. Painful though it was to admit, I had found a home far away from the land where I took my first breath. Comrades far removed from my flesh and blood. The icy winds of winter finally gave way to the vibrant blossom of spring. But our resolves never wavered. We adjusted, trained, and grew, a formidable force. Elbow to elbow, our hearts beating in time with the distant war drums. Our uniform might have been the defining shade of northern blue, but our spirits were a nip of undying resilience. A dash of quiet introspection, a swig of desperate courage, our shared recipe for surviving the fractured existence we'd inherited. Being a part of the Union Army meant more than just marching under their banner. It was an acceptance of mindset, the congenial camaraderie, shared duties, and a legacy that transcended beyond the boundaries of states. When the real test came, and the bugle of the opponents echoed menacingly, we were to stand shoulder to shoulder, not just as soldiers of the Union, but as brothers under the same azure sky. This transformation of a Southern youngster naive to the ugliness of war to a Union soldier was not just about swapping gray for blue. It was a testament to the human spirit's resilience, which knows no bounds when it comes to survival. I might have set on this path by the whims of a young heart's aspirations, but I stayed because of the profound journey of self-discovery the detour awarded. Under the general's watchful gaze, I walked a winding path that was as tumultuous as it was enlightening. The lessons I was learning here were hard-earned, imprinted on my soul by the fiery brandeis of war. As we filed back to our quarters, under the watchful gaze of a waning gibbous, we were tired, cold, and nursing wounds that ran much deeper than the skin. But we shared hot rations, stories, and the burden of the war. Beneath the golden-orange flames of the campfire, amidst echoing laughter and eldritch war tales, I found my place amongst the Union's brave souls. I was far from the sprawling farms of South Carolina, draped not in gray, but in Union blue. My homeland felt like a distant dream. And I was here, serenading under the northern constellation. But there was an undeniable courage, breaking free from the detritus of the past, embracing the present despite the uncertainty, despite the war. Perhaps it was this audacity of hope that gave every soldier the strength to endure, to fight, and to hope for a better tomorrow. And as I closed my eyes under the star-kissed northern sky, the cross of valor pinned snugly against my heart, I allowed the day's reminiscence to lull me into sleep at last. Yes, I was a Southern boy, and yet there I was, donning the blue of the Union, daring to live, daring to dream, all under the crimson hues of the same tirelessly watching sky. N. 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 Chapter 6. N. 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 The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder and raw fear. We were in the belly of the battle, the landscape playfully dramatized by the lingering fog and the distant whiff of mustard gas. War, like a flashy puppeteer, dangled us all on a string, pulling, twisting, and turning us into a grotesque dance to the rhythm of chaos. Rows upon rows of Union soldiers stood tall, our shoulders squared, rifles firm in our clutches, an army ready to step into the abyss of war. Next to me, Private Jenkins, a fresh-faced lad barely out of his teens from Boston, trembled, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously, his knuckles white against the grip of his rifle. He seemed a living paradox, a terror-stricken soldier on a warpath. Above us, the sky hung heavy with foreboding, dark clouds stretching as far as the eye could see. The moody, gray landscape sprawled out in front of us was a cruel artist's portrayal of the grimness of war. Here, valor did not shimmer like a well-ornamented knight's armor. Instead, it was visible in the steadiness of a raw recruit's trembling hands, the firm resolve in a veteran's war-crafted eyes. Or even perhaps, hidden within my blue coat, a Southern boy standing amidst his Northern comrades, trapped in a war that wasn't entirely mine, but one that I had adopted willingly. The first light of dawn was merely a dim twinkle when the bugle sounded its jarring notes, the echo reverberating ominously across the battlefield. My heartbeat spiked, adrenaline coursing through my veins as the realization sunk. Here it was, my first real battle as a Union soldier. Not as a spy or an impartial observer but as a willing participant of this lethal tango. As we charged forward, I barely noticed the harsh slap of frigid breeze against my skin or the muddy earth squelching beneath our boots. All my senses zeroed in on the sprawling field ahead and the cluster of Confederate soldiers lined up like gray ghosts, their youthful faces thrust into a dance of death none of them likely signed up for voluntarily. It was surreal. Their well-remembered accents, their vows, boys and men, not unlike me, caught up in the whirlwind of war, shouldered the unbearable weight of their homeland's expectations. I realized, choking on the bitter irony, that I could just as well have been in their place, shooting at the blue men charging at us. The bugle sounded again, louder this time, tearing through the eerie calm. Minutes drew out like morbid hours. And then, all hell broke loose. Before I could grasp the reality of the unfolding scene, the sharp sound of bullet discharge and the piercing war cries filled the air. Smoke curled up from gunfire, dancing devilishly across the battlefield, obscuring the vision. The world imploded into a blood-curdling symphony of pained screams, desperation, and raw fear. Any remaining romantic notions of war were shredded with the first volley of bullets. I found myself amidst a melee of chaos and unleashed violence. Gun smoke clouded my vision, and a sea of gray and blue blended into a disoriented whirl. The air hummed with the deadly song of passing bullets, each one masked with the potential of carrying a soul with it to the afterlife. Opting not to think about who their recipients could be, I instead focused on loading my rifle, my fingers working mechanically on the taut spring and lead bullets. The sporadic memories of the drilling back at the Union camp proved to be a bizarre comfort on the battlefield. My mind was eerily numbed, yet acutely aware. The paradox of being a part of the mayhem yet feeling distant. Shoot, reload, duck. The words seemed to play on a loop, a morbid mantra imparting a rhythm to my increasingly automatic movements. Suddenly, out of the blur of chaotic battle, a figure charged at me, a Confederate soldier. His face contorted in a grimace of desperation. Rhett, a boy from our neighboring farm. The realization hit me like a bolt. In another lifetime, we had climbed trees, stolen apples, and chuckles at shared secrets. Two ordinary boys caught up in the realm of childhood adventures. Now, here he was, a mere outline of his former self, aiming the deadly barrel of his gun at me. Before I could process the horrifying reality, the report of a gunshot echoed, followed by an uncomfortably wet thump. Rhett, the boy from the farm, crumbled to the ground, his wide eyes still locked onto mine. A visceral pain shot through my chest, leaving me breathless. The battle around me started to cave in. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the deafening cries and explosions that engulfed us. I could hear my pulse, could almost count my foggy breaths, and an ice-cold realization. War, the grand, historic event I'd daydreamed about with Nate on our rickety porch, was indeed heroic, but not in the grand, ancient cavalier way. It was devastatingly, tragically heroic. It was the trembling hands steadying a bayonet, the gritted teeth against a pain-filled scream, a friend's face growing ghostly pale as his life bled out on the muddy ground. The heroic saga of war was a saga of survival, of ordinary men pushed into an extraordinary circus of violence. Several yards away, General Hughes, as stalwart as ever, commanded the remaining of our troops. A mortar exploded near him, tossing him in the air like a rag doll before he fell back to the earth with brutal force. My heart squeezed at the sight, instincts kick-starting my frozen limbs. Ducking low, I navigated the deadly labyrinth of flying bullets and falling comrades until I reached him. Hughes was sprawled on the ground, stunned and gasping for breath but still conscious. Blood gushed through his fingers where he was clutching his side, staining the frosted soil beneath him a stark, terrifying crimson. His eyes met mine, the familiar twinkle replaced with stark dread. For the first time since I'd known him, General Hughes, the stern mentor, the willing father, the guiding beacon, looked vulnerable. "Boy," he rasped out, his teeth gritted in pain. "The battle, it doesn't need kings or gods. It needs courageous hearts." His voice faded, his grip on my jacket slackening, his grizzled face contorting before his eyes closed, his head leaning back onto the blood-soaked ground. Looking down at the listless body of Hughes, my northern compass, My world seemed to tilt violently. The remaining green patches of landscape were smudged with the horrible monotony of gray and red. A sense of unsettling silence filled me. A hollow rhythm of a tragedy played upon my heartstrings. Today, I'd shot at my past friends. Watched innocent men splattered against the doom's palette, and the worst of all, watched Hughes fall. The man who had at every stumbling step of mine imparted me lessons of maturity, led me towards a broader perspective. Grief, hot and unadorned, washed over me, leaving a haunting trail of regret and an unfillable void. The general was not just another soldier who fell today. He was my tether to sanity in the pandemonium of war. He was my route to introspection. A bridge that allowed a boy torn between dueling loyalties to cross over and join a cause much bigger than individual selves. Sergeant Davis, his face grim and splattered with mud and blood, hauled me to my feet, pulling me back into formation. A familiar spark flickered in my gut, a profound realization taking root. I had a responsibility to uphold, a promise to keep, a legacy to continue. The battle was far from over, and I had a role to play. As I picked up my rifle and headed back into the chaos, I didn't just carry a weapon. I carried along General Hughes' faith in me, his teachings, his hopes for a gallant future. I fought that day, not for the Callahan blood or Union's cause alone, but as a symbol of the unique bond that was sliced painfully short. By the evening, the battlefield was gleaming with the glow of the setting sun, making the hellish landscape slightly dreamier. The remaining of us, the survivors of the day, were standing scattered, our faces reflecting a haunting palette of loss and despair. The battlefield bore the aftermath of a bitter argument between feuding sides. Bodies strewn around haphazardly, like discarded playthings. The day was retreating, and with it, a part of me, forever scarred by the grim face of war, was receding into the shadows. We were a fragmented battalion returning to the war-torn fortress, our blue uniforms soaked with dust and blood, the weight of loss making every step heavier. But as the chilly night whispered over the day's grim remnants, echoing Hughes' words, I finally understood. War was indeed not about wins but survival. Survival of men, of their sanity, of their lessons, and most importantly, survival of their brave hearts in an unforgiving world. So, Eli Callahan, continued. I marched on, away and into this heroic saga called war, carrying wounds that cut deeper than skin, experiences darker than the night, and a mentor's legacy that was brighter than the morning sun. On those war-torn landscapes, the terrified boy was chiseling himself into a hardened soldier. Each day, a stroke closer to etching out a man from the uncut stone that he was. N. Chapter 7. N. In the dark days following the battle, I found myself existing in a fog of disillusionment. Between denial and crippling reality, I often caught myself staring at the vacant desk in the general's office, half expecting him to shuffle in any moment, his stern face illuminated by the dancing candlelight, only to stare at the waxy, untouched surface. The pall of death had coated everything in a suffocating shroud, its ghostly whispers lurking in every corner and crevice. The death of General Hughes had not only left an unfillable void in my life but in the spirit of the entire battalion. Lonely nights were now spent scouring through the general's paperwork, his meticulously written battle strategies and coded missives a comforting echo of his diligence. Nights blurred into mornings as I tried to understand his grand vision for the Union, the dream that now seemed maddeningly distant. But amidst the haunting silence of the midnight hours and the relentless echo of ticking seconds, a seed of determination was sprouting within me. It was fueled not by a desire to win the war but by a pressing need to avenge Hughes's death. a blooming obsession for revenge against the Confederate soldier who had extinguished the beacon. Guiding me through this tumultuous war, days began to feel impersonal, uneventful. Once favorites, now duties like cleaning the firearms, preparing the horses, and attending drills felt excruciatingly tiresome. Time seemed to be divided into vaguely inconsequential moments of false normalcy interspersed with violent shreds of reality. Meals were taken in silence. Once cheerful conversations replaced by morose contemplation and resentful determination. Comrades eyed me warily, the Union blue on my shoulders now accentuating the Confederate roots that ran beneath my skin. But it was a silent agreement between us all that our shared grief superseded the North-South divide. One night, as I sat poring over another one of Hughes's detailed military plans, I noticed a torn piece of paper from a notepad that seemed to have slipped under the mahogany bookshelf. Picking it up, I immediately recognized Hughes's austere handwriting. A wave of unbearable nostalgia washed over me as I tried to make out his words. It was written a few days before the fatal battle. A message concerning a Confederate soldier he had noticed during the previous face-off. The description given was vague but intriguing. A soldier in his prime. His gray uniform adorned with significant badges. His actions deemed suspicious by the general. A flicker of an idea began to ignite inside me. Perhaps this man was the Confederate soldier who had been responsible for Hughes's demise. It was a glaring straw of suspicion. But I was a drowning man desperate to avenge my mentor. The following weeks saw me exhausting my resources, pulling every string of acquaintance or intelligence I had amassed during my tenure as a Union soldier. Any spare moment was dedicated to the soldier's manhunt. His vague description embedded in my mind. The relentless quest took me from friendly pubs to the dark underbelly of clandestine secret operations. Many times I hit a dead end. But the image of Hughes's lifeless body kept fueling my determination. The need for revenge became an all-consuming fire, ignoring the perilous path it was leading me towards. Soon enough, the frustrating days of tactile silence and dead ends came to an end. A coded message reached me from one of our Union scouts. A Confederate soldier matching the one I had been searching for had been spotted. The word was that he'd been spotted acting notably peculiar during the last few clashes and had made a significant enemy of numerous Confederate officials because of his reckless actions. My heart pounded in my chest, the rhythm echoing my rage, fear, and anticipation. Still, I employed a calming breath, reminding myself that it was not yet the time. The soldier's investigation would take some more time before I could have my confrontation. Over the ensuing days, the enemy soldier's intelligence trickled in, fueling my resolve to face him. I learned that he was a former Southern aristocrat, an expert in hand-to-hand combat and a sharpshooter. His name was Nathaniel Callahan, a name that hummed with a bone-chilling familiarity, a haunting whisper from my past ignoring the icy tendrils of shock that began to grapple my heart. I reviewed the records again, refusing to believe in the coincidence. In a cruel twist of fate, the nemesis I had hunted with a relentless obsession was none other than Nathaniel, my elder brother. Dreams of brotherhood of the past started fading in the harsh, teetering shadows of the bitter present. The same brother who had shared innocent dreams of valor and gallantry now stood on the other side of the war, both of us ensnared by the brutal reality of our very own heroic saga. Days morphed into a monotonous blur, my inner turmoil extinguishing every ember of normalcy. The war raged on in the backdrop, its chaotic orchestra merely a white noise to the blistering war within me. I defied time, space and treacherous thoughts, clinging onto the bare threads of sanity, preparing myself for the inevitable confrontation with my beloved brother turned bitter adversary. After all, the battleground was not just a vast spread of war-torn barren land. It was upon the slippery abyss of familial bonds, pulverized under the crushing weight of principles and complex loyalties. When the day of the final showdown came, I found myself standing on the precipice of a harsh reality. The boy who had embarked on this journey in the name of Southern pride was now a Union soldier, seeking revenge on his own kin. War was indeed a ruthless puppeteer, twisting ordinary lives into a grotesque dance of chaos. I was not just a player in the war, not a spectator for the brutal romance of courage and blood. I was the stage, where love, loyalty, and betrayal staged their heartbreaking drama. That day, I wasn't just fighting the war of the North and South, or the warring blues and grays. It was the silent war of two brothers, their bonds of brotherhood battling the opposing loyalties. As I marched towards the battlefield, my heart thundered against the quiet promise of retribution. The hero of the saga was finally walking towards his nemesis, a brother ready to avenge his mentor's demise from the hands of another brother. Charging onto the battlefield, I was a man on a mission of vengeance that was about to change the course of my life forever. N. Chapter 8. As dawn stretched thin across the battlefield, the frontier of the Civil War had become a menacing stage for the impending confrontation. The early morning chill clung to my threadbare uniform while the ground underneath me gnawed at the soles of my boots. The landscape in slow awakening held still as though holding its own breath, just as I was waiting for the fog of war to lift with the dawn. It was a herald of destiny. The numbing quiet before the storm of gunfire and blood. I stood among the Union ranks, waiting with varying degrees of patience and apprehension. Our orders were to advance at sunrise, rushing the Confederate line opposite us. From the intelligence pouring in for the last 2 days, we knew Nathaniel was among them. The thought prickled my senses. The unsettling mix of familiarity and resentment churned a whirlpool in my gut. Despite the countless hours I had spent preparing for this very encounter, the reality scratched new lines of worry on my forehead. The camp was now bereft of any cheer or idle chatter typically evident in army barracks. The brothers in arms evaded one another's eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the gentle swell of fear in our hearts. Many of us were boys when we started, wrapping ourselves in the romantic allure of gallantry, longing for an adventure bigger than our backyards. We were boys heading distinctive paths, merging on an unexpected crossroad of war. War, though, had given us both courage and wear, turning boys into warriors. Private Jenkins, now a friend, offered a nod of solidarity as he sidled up to me. His eyes were clear, but the tightening of his jaw expressed his thoughts better than words. "Bottle's dawn is soon. You ready, Eli?" His voice was steady, but it did nothing to soothe the unnerving anticipation coursing through me. The sun, meanwhile, was nipping at the eastern horizon, eager to reveal the battlefield, a harsh reminder of our impending confrontation with mortality. I replied curtly, my decision as strong as the bayonet gleaming at my side. "Yes, I am ready." The sun finally spread its crimson touch across the canvas of the morning sky, and the bugle burst into a chilling tune, announcing the commencement of yet another bloody dance of death. The day had begun, the seconds ticking off to the moment of confrontation. I took my position, my heartbeat setting a steady rhythm to the impending chaos. With my sights straight ahead, my mind was a broken picture reel of the past, sunlit porches, lighter times, and easier laughs. But as the echo of the bugle's call softened, I wound myself back into reality, to the Union soldier covered in the remnants of the Confederate boy he used to be. With the first call to charge, we were off, our boots pounding on the frost-covered landscape. My heart echoing the beats in my chest. The battlefield roared to life as the bullets whizzed past. Rays of the dawn sun glinting off the gunmetal. Chaos promptly stitched itself into the fabric of the morning, weaving a horrifying tapestry of sounds and cries. A grotesque melody reverberating through every soldier present. Through the ringing in my ears, a distinct battle cry cut through. A riveting wave of familiarity tore through my focus, and my eyes zeroed in on the cause. Ahead, among the cascades of Confederate soldiers, I spotted him. The figure, intensely familiar, was charging towards the Union strike, leading his cavalry. His uniform, tattered and gray, was adorned with insignia. Nathaniel. His face, recognizable despite the angry red cuts etched across his cheekbone, was taut with determination. His eyes mirrored my own, a tormented mix of recognition and resolve. Time seemed to slow down, blurring the faces of other soldiers, as though we were the only two left on this desolate landscape. Stripped away from the commonality of brotherhood, we embraced the unlikelihood of the circumstance. We were enemies. I snapped back into reality, the sound of gunfire cutting through my reverie. Reaching my belt, my grip closed around the cold handle of my pistol. I dismounted under the heated hail of bullets, moving with swift determinacy towards Nathaniel. My actions were mechanical, spurred by the adrenaline now coursing through my veins. His figure loomed ahead, growing closer with every step I took against the tide of charging Confederates. Finally, we were within shooting distance. I raised my firearm, meeting Nathaniel's eyes, which were round with surprise and a shouted warning lodged in his throat. He stumbled on his steps, dropping to an unlikely kneel, his hand springing up in silent surrender. "I yield," he gasped raggedly, the first clear words I'd heard since the battle horns. The desperation clung to the edges of his voice as he cast his weapon aside. A clear wail of surrender. His proud stance had evaporated, replaced by a quivering boy, eyes shining with regret, standing between the lines of the feuding North and South. A glimmer of my older brother appeared, the same Nate I once looked upon for support and reassurance. For a fleeting moment, I was back on the sunny porch of our family home. The smell of ripe peaches in the air. A carefree boy listening to the heroic tales of valor. Yet the gruesome reality of our bleary surroundings snapped me back. His surrender, though clear, was lost on me. Here was the man who had brought about my mentor's demise. A man of my blood, asking me for mercy. I hesitated before shaking my head, my focus unwavering. My hands, used to the gun's weight and grip, squeezed the trigger. A deafening bang split the morning air, followed by a petrifying silence. Nathaniel, my blood brother, dropped to the ground, disarmed and shocked, clutching his side where red bloomed, a stark contrast to the gray of his uniform. His mouth was agape, his breaths quickening as my world slowed to a cruel march. The sensory world around me faded into a meaningless hum while the visual took horrifying precedence. On the killing fields where soldiers were reduced to numbers rather than respected for their individualities, it felt overtly personal. My brother downed by my gun. Fire and smoke twisted themselves around the moment, engulfing Nathaniel and me, as silence echoed through our little pocket removed from the carnage. I kneeled next to him, my gun slipping out of my fingers. I had sought revenge and attained it, at the cost of wounding my brother. Although we stood on opposite ends of this war, the blood that we shed was the same. As the chaos moved away, I found myself in a devastating bubble of silence, alone with my brother while the war evolved around us. This bloody sunrise marked the end of one journey, the culmination of my hunted vengeance and the revelation of a distorted era of self-introspection. While the world spun about its axis, as the lines of blue and gray clashed and retreated, as men fell and rose, two brothers cloaked in a painful silence marked the end of a chapter. I had killed a nameless enemy, only to unmask a regretful revelation. The act of revenge meant for closure only left me on the edge of an ominous abyss. It was devastation by dawn, a fratricidal act that irreversibly pivoted my life. The dawn held onto its crimson tint as I looked down onto Nathaniel. Pain radiated from his face. But he mustered a weak grin. It echoed from another life. A happier time tainted by the circumstances we found ourselves in. I touched his shoulder. The Union blue making its contrast against the Confederate gray. Our eyes met, and I saw my reflection, a victim of war. A faded echo of the boy I once was. And a man molded by the twisted hands of war. And in that connection forged by the merciless reality of war. We were two boys that had dreamt of gallantry. Led astray by the ruthless torrent of survival. It was the saddest of the hero's journeys, an adventure that started at an innocent porch and culminated in a fratricidal revelation on a bloodied battlefield. The saga which was thought to be heroic was, in fact, a disillusionment of two intertwined souls. The dawn having broken, I was left with the glaring reality of my deeds. Revenge sought and taken. Brotherhood strained under the weight of conflicting loyalties. And fractured innocence asserting the irrevocable touch of war. As day spread across the night's canvas, I was left amidst ruins of my actions, my emotions, and the haunting impact of my choices. The battlefield a mirror to my internal destruction. From the depth of the abyss, the daunting path of redemption twinkled faintly, marking the end of my revenge and the beginning of my atonement. N. Chapter 9. The chill of the morning sunrise had barely passed, yet it felt like a lifetime. The sun's rays lounged lazily across the war-torn battlefield, pretty little blushes of dawn revealing the grim reality of the aftermath. The sounds of muskets still echoed in my ears, drowning in an abyss of silence. A lament for the fallen. I could still smell the acrid scent of gunpowder and blood, a mixture that no man could forget after facing combat. The clear field marred by bodies of blue and gray. A haunting display of memento mori as the crows began their grotesque feast. I stood there at the heart of the battlefield, my heart thundering against the ribcage. The silence a weight upon my shoulders. My breath hitched, my trembling hands wiping away the cold sweat. The world spun around me in an unforgiving dance of war-torn chaos. There he was, lying on the dirt-covered ground. The Confederate gray of his uniform stained a dark crimson. His chest heaved with ragged breaths. His teeth grit against the pain. Nathaniel, my brother. The sight ate at my insides. A sickly feeling of guilt, regret, and horror curling tightly around my heart. My own kin by blood, an enemy by war, lay motionless under my watchful eyes. His life slowly ebbing away. My body was rooted to the spot. My mind a whirlpool of fragmented thoughts and regret. Even the smallest move felt like an enormous effort. The unseen weight of guilt anchoring me down. As the dawn began to shed its crimson hues, the gravity of the situation finally set in. I'd just killed my brother. A torrent of self-reproach and remorse surged through me, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. I killed Nathaniel. The sentence played on a morose loop. Its echo a chilling reminder of my irreversible actions. An intense feeling of loneliness and despair washed over me. The pathetic figure of my brother. The weak rise and fall of his chest. The stain of blood seeping into the soil. The violence of the scene seared itself onto my memory. The consequences of my actions began to set in. The boy I used to be, the naive, eager young man drawn into the romantic allure of gallantry and dream of heroics, was no more. In his place stood a remorseful man. The bitter taste of reality stinging the insides of his mouth. I had succumbed not to gallantry but to vengeance. to the gruesome dance of reality that descended from the hallowed dreams of gallantry. Regret wasn't a strong enough word. It felt like an insignificant speck against the vast expanse of guilt and despair that was my current reality. An overwhelming sense of remorse saturated the air, each breath reminding me of the fratricide. Looking across the expanse of lifeless bodies, I was struck by a harsh realization. In this bloody farce of heroism and honor, no man stood victorious. We were all victims, entrapped in an unforgiving cycle of violence and death. A faint sliver of hope dawned as my attention snapped back towards Nathaniel. Encased in autumn's chilly morning breeze, my brother, my enemy, was still alive, a precious heartbeat soldering on against all odds. His rough, desperate gasps for breath cut through the silence, shaking me from my stupor. I rushed to his side, my heart pounding against my ribcage. The familiar face of my brother, once healthy and strong, was now pale and drawn in pain. His tired, half-open eyes, brimming with fear and confusion, locked onto me. It was an eerie moment. Our roles reversed. The trajectory of our lives drastically altered. The boy he protected, nurtured and guided lay above him now. A killer. His hand lay a few inches from mine, clyster cold against the morning chill. Slowly, reluctance looming in my every step, my fingers crossed the small gulf, wrapping around his hand. Despite the quiet winter breeze and the growing sunlight, I was encased in silent reminiscence, painted with the shades of innocent memories and darker hues of betrayal. His grip, weak yet comforting, tightened around my hand as he tried to sit up. Instead, he ended up coughing, wincing in pain as he fell back against the earth. I watched in silence, heart clenching as the repercussions of my actions unfolded in the raw physicality of his broken form. The moment stretched on, humming with a profound intensity I had never known before. I had dragged us both down to this abyss, and now I was trapped here, caught in an overwhelming wave of guilt and regret. A fratricide. These cruel strings of war had somehow found a way to orchestrate such a heartbreaking symphony, where the hunter was responsible for the demise of his own kin. From the sidelines of a South Carolina farm, through the lively streets of our hometown to the sprawling, war-torn battlefields of Virginia, we shared a beautiful journey of brotherhood, even as the comforting blanket of shared memories threatened to pull me under. I was rudely shaken awake by the damning reality of now. Pulling my gaze from Nathaniel, I looked at the rising sun. The golden rays were washing over the lifeless bodies scattered across the open field, while the feathered culprits took to the skies with their gruesome winnings, cawing in victory. Cold, gray, unmerciful victory, the kind I'd achieved. Numbness crept over me, slowly enveloping every inch of my being. I was a hollow, guilt-ridden shell of the man who'd set foot on this battlefield. The regret, guilt and PTSD was a solitary sentence. A bereaved brother left under the cascades of his own blood, and the haunting echoes of my victory. His mournful gasps of breath were a piercing symphony, carving into my heart with every labored beat. There we were, two brothers intertwined by the cruel chains of fratricide, entrapped under the elaborate charade of war. Our shared past and present formed a haunting echo in this chilling dawn. A whisper from another lifetime. It was a painful epiphany under the mournful gaze of the rising sun. Surrounded by the macabre dance of crows, with regret as my only companion, my actions left more than just a physical imprint on the battlefield. They left me with a heartache, a void that would consume me if I let it. Returning my attention back to Nathaniel, a broken sigh escaped my lips. His breaths were now slower, more labored. An ominous silence hung over us, punctuated by his raspy breathings and the sporadic cries of the cawing crows. I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't turn back the clock and rectify my actions. And that was the most terrifying part of it all. the finality of my actions. As the sun fully emerged over the horizon and the chilling night faded into the stark day, reality closed around me. The fratricide, the silent war of siblings, and the irreplaceable severity of my actions on the battlefield culminated in a haunting dawn. I realized then that the war taking place around us was just the backdrop. The real war was the one within me. A brother had fallen on this vast battlefield. But beyond that, a piece of my soul had been forever lost. The haunting echo of the lethal shot still rung in my ears. Each reverberation a sharp reminder of my guilt. A tragic melody of the cruel dance of war. The heroic sagas and romanticized ideals of war had been shattered to reveal their brutal reality. The boy who set foot in the war, diligent and fresh-faced, had transformed into a regretful man, now standing on the edge of the abyss. With each passing moment, the merciless symphony of crows and bleak battlefield marked the stark reality. Beneath the grandeur of chivalric warfare, two brothers fought their quiet battle, a silent war scarring their very souls. The testament of our bond seeped into the earth of this battlefield, absorbed by the very roots of the conflict, becoming one with the blood-stained soil. Hot tears started pooling in my eyes, blurring the gruesome scene. My brother, my flesh and blood, reduced to a sergeant at my hand. Revenge meant no victory, and pride bore no heroics. It was the regrettable truth of war, the truth we were protected from, a truth I now bore on my conscience. I found that my victims had names. They had stories. They had families. Today, my victim was my brother, and the shooter was me. Today, Soldier Eli Callahan bore the daunting title of fratricide in a war that promised only fleeting, hollow victories. As the cold realization stirred within me, I was starkly aware that the greatest battle was about to begin, my inner war of repentance. My need for revenge culminated in the chilling dance of fratric. N. 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 Chapter 10. N. 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 Bitter regret washed over me as I watched my wounded brother lay motionless. This had been my doing. I'd been hungry for revenge, convinced that it would serve justice for my fallen mentor. Yet, as I watched Nathaniel grasp for breath, the cruel reality of my revenge resonated with every beat of my heart. I wished for a moment that I was dreaming, waiting to wake up and re-emerge in a world where the line demarcating the enemy remained clear. But as the harsh winter breeze slapped across my face, the sounds of distant cannons continued their woeful symphony, and the stench of fresh blood seized my senses. I could not escape the reality of my fratricide. I felt a throb of pain in my heart as I watched the man who had been my role model, my guiding star, reduced to a defeated soldier by my hand. The sight of Nathaniel, his once prided uniform now stained with unforgiving crimson, his eyes holding an echo of shock and confusion. It was as if I was watching the death of my own innocence play out on the battlefield. My gaze fell on our entwined hands. His grip was weakening. A shackle had stormed over us, locking us in a moment that seemed untouched by the progression of time. The war, with its unending chaos, was a distant hum, a background to the prompt reality before us. Two brothers, one wounded by the other's hand. The cruel dance of war, the deceptive promises of gallantry, the intoxicating dance towards revenge, all led to this moment. I remember thinking of the words Hughes once shared. War doesn't create heroes or villains, Eli. It creates survivors on both sides. His words now made sense, bearing a weight of truth that I'd been oblivious to. I wasn't a hero seeking revenge but a survivor, fighting my inner demons. Nathaniel's chest heaved. His breath labored as he tried to hold onto the thin thread of life. His eyes, once filled with shimmering stories of Southern courage and pride, were clouded with pain and regret. His gaze met mine, and the raw vulnerability mirrored in those familiar green eyes pricked my conscience. "Eli," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper against the rising wind. My heart recoiled at the familiar twang of his southern drawl. Nathaniel, my protector, was now reduced to a pitiful plea of recognition. "Eli," he urged again, pain etched onto every syllable, even as a band tightened around my chest. As our shared past collided with the bleak reality of the present, I had to muster the strength to offer solace to him, to our shattered bond. At that moment, I let down the soldier's guard Hughes had mentored me to carry. I let down the shield of vengeance that drove me to act. And in the light of the rising sun, I was once again the younger Callahan. "Nate, I am here." My voice wavered, breaking at the end as I squeezed his hand in mine. Would he forgive me in the face of gruesome betrayal? A look of flickering relief crossed his eyes, perhaps comforted by the pledge of brotherhood we had made as boys. Echoed now on the brutal turf of warfare, surrounded by war's wreckage, we were still brothers connected by an unbreakable bond of shared blood and memories. As I looked across the field of fallen soldiers draped in both blue and gray, the victims of a dispute that held no personal meaning to them, a question formed in my entangled thoughts. We were all victims of the war's fickle game. No man was a hero or an enemy here. So, who was the real enemy? I realized then that the enemy was not a man or a belief, but the war itself. The war that managed to penetrate our noble pursuits and twist them into horrifying acts of violence. I sat there on the battlefield, grappling with this chilling revelation, while Nathaniel grasped for every breath between us. The sun had completed its ascent, and the cries of the crows played out a melancholy tune. I was aware of the icy numbness spreading through me, a stark contrast to the warm brotherly bond we'd held. The remainder of the day morphed into an unsettling blend of grief and guilt. I tended to Nathaniel the best I could, wiping away at the dirt that stained his face, offering reassuring words that felt hollow to my own ears. All the while, I was battling an internal war, my soul a gruesome battlefield. Our shared laughter echoed around the ghost towns of my memory, clashing with the raw reality with every gust of wind that swept across the battlefield. From horse races across the southern plains to dough-covered faces in Mrs. Hathaway's bakery, images of innocence and carefree adolescence clashed with Nathaniel's pale and pained face. The implications of my actions had enormous repercussions, not just on the battlefield but within me. As I fought my guilt, the fallen Union general's words resonated within me. I had turned my vengeance into resistance without realizing the predestined role of a fratricide in the cruel puppet show of war. When the sun finally sank beneath the horizon, bathing the battlefield once again in the blanket of the night, I held my breath as I watched his struggle for life subside. A wave of chilling finality washed over me. "Eli," he breathed out weakly. His grip slackened in my hand, his breaths growing shallow. "Promise me." Quote, "Yes, Nathaniel," I urged him to continue, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. "What is it?" Quote, "Live." His voice. N. Chapter 11. My name was Eli Callahan. I was a Union soldier. I killed my brother. 3 statements that carried the weight of 1,000 mountains. Truths that had become my reality. I found myself sitting next to the lifeless body of my elder brother. A wave of grim realization washing over me. The fratricidal echo of gunshots still rang in my ears, its reverberations setting my body ablaze with remorse and despair. It had always been my brother and I against the world. A pair of young souls with a hunger for adventures and dreams as vast as the Carolina sky. Yet, there I was, my soul bearing the scar of my betrayals. A mantra of melancholy and hollow victory ringing in my heart. A lone survivor in an age-old conflict that had demanded my brother's life as a sacrifice. The stark truth, however, remained. I was a fratricide now, eternally bound by the chains of my actions. In the soft glow of the moonlight, I watched Nathaniel's peaceful face, a wordless tribute to the bond we had shared before the iron wings of war had torn us apart. It was a cruel juxtaposition, the gentleness of his unbreathing face against the harsh reality of his fate. As I looked at him, my mind threatened to plunge into the depths of despair. Yet, I found myself drawn into the tempest of our past, forcibly pulled into the archives of innocent laughter, warm southern skies, and stories filled with Confederate nights. The simplicity, the unadulterated joy of our childhood, now overshadowed by the savage beast of war. Reality kept pressing into me, moment by moment. It demanded me to come to terms with the grim heroes that lay strewn about on the battlefield. Faces unanimated by their dreams. Hopes stripped bare by the fatal jaws of war and conflict. I closed my eyes, feeling the cold breath of guilt weave sinewy chains around my taut heartstrings. A Union soldier by heart, a Confederate by birth, and a fratricide for eternity, I had become etymology's tragic victim. In the midst of all this, the image of General Hughes floated up in my mind, an anchor of reason amid tumultuous seas of confusion and guilt. His words, like precious gems, illuminating the path that I must tread. War doesn't breed heroes, Eli, his firm voice had once declared, barely a crease of emotion marring his stoic features. It leaves survivors, men and women bearing the burden of their actions, struggling under the weight of choices made in the face of adversity. He had been right. I was now a survivor. A survivor burdened with the regret of having shot down my own kin. Desperately wrestling with the echoes of my choices. A feeling of loss consumed me. Not only had I lost my only family to war, but I had also lost respect for myself. The Union soldier that I was. The Confederate dreamer at heart. It felt like I'd forfeited a part of me that day. A part that was intricately tied to Nathaniel. Yet, I also understood that I had gained something. A painful insight into the price of vengeance and the true cost of conflict. Drenched in guilt and sorrow, I realized that it was time to move. If I had to survive this war, both the physical one around me and the inner one raging within my conscience, I needed to leave this place. The grim stage where the tragic story of the Callahan brothers met its cruel climax. Tearing my eyes away from the sight of Nathaniel's lifeless body, I stood up on numb feet. The world swirled around me, feeling strangely distant yet oppressively close. Every corner of it echoing with tales of loss and despair. As I took one step after another, memories made and dreams shattered on this very soil came surging back. It felt like walking over a battlefield strewn with shards from my shattered past. Each piece sharp with regret, resounding with my fallen illusions. Yet, I walked forward, an embodiment of survival grappling with the bitter truths of war. I walked through the cold night towards the Union camp, my silhouette a solitary figure against the backdrop of a moonlit memorial to human folly. Reaching the Union camp, I was met with familiar faces, oblivious to my inner turmoil. Men sitting around dwindling fires, sharing stories of their spectacle of bravery on the battlefield, their faces flickering with the weed-induced illusion of camaraderie. During my training days, I would have eagerly joined them, eager to soak in their tales, to share a laugh. However, things had changed irreversibly for me. The decision I had made that day on the battlefield had severed the invisible thread that had once tied me to them. I was now a lone soldier, branded by the guilt of my actions, bereft of any semblance of camaraderie. Every fiber of my being felt heavy, as if I was carrying the weight of my guilt on my own shoulders. I moved soundlessly towards my assigned bunk, eager to escape the boisterous chatter and the overpowering chill of the night, to seek solace in solitude. As I crouched down next to my cot, my eyes fell on a piece of crumpled paper peeping out from under my blanket. Letters from our homestead to Nathaniel. Letters filled with simple tales of Mrs. Hathaway's bakery, the new calves in Farmer Jacob's barn, our dog's constant quest to chase his tail. Letters that now served as a swirling vortex back into a timeline much simpler, untouched by the searing flames of the war. The paper felt fragile in my hand. Parchment that once contained the elixir of hope for a homesick soldier now lay redundant, a cruel reminder of dreams buried under the rubble of vengeance. A slash of pain tore through me as I realized how futile it all had been. Our dreams, our aspirations. We had sought adventures, craved heroic stories of our own. And here I was, left with a soul-crushing plot twist that turned me into the antagonist of my own story. The night ticked on slowly. Melancholy whispers of the wind, a constant reminder of the grim reality beyond the confines of this tent. My guilt-stricken figure, stark contrast to the heartening solidarity of the men outside. Sleep was a distant dream, unreachable under the throbbing weight of regret that lay heavy on every breath drawn. The memory of Nathaniel, his last pleading gaze filled with disbelief, etched starkly onto the canvas of my mind, resurfaced with a vengeance. In his absence, I bore his likeness, a testament to the bond that no war could erase. Under the dim moonlight filtering in through the small opening of the tent, I held on to the scant traces of the past, the comfort in shared memories, a brittle shield against the chilling remorse that lapped at the corners of my mind. It was then that a terrible certainty hit me. The war had not only robbed Nathaniel from me, but it had also done something far more devious, far more sinister. It had stolen my innocence, my naive belief in the gallantry of warfare, and replaced it with a harsh truth. No man ever emerges victorious from the clutches of conflict. Yes, I was Eli Callahan. I had been a passionate Confederate, then a Union soldier. I had killed my elder brother, Nathaniel, driven by revenge, blinded by fury, and now, shrouded by regret's relentless tide, forever marred by the consequences of my actions. I realized that my true battle had only just begun, a cleansing war against my guilt, penance for my fratricide, while navigating the treacherous tides of remorse and redemption that loomed ominously ahead. N N N N N N N N N N N N N N N N about the author. N N N N N N N N everything in this novel, except for what you are reading right now, was generated entirely by artificial intelligence, using coding logic written by Bobby Hancock. I wrote this novel as a demonstration of the incredible power of large language models. This entire novel, including the pictures and everything in between, was generated using large language models, chaining logic, and plot reduction. The code is generalized. The only thing specifically used to generate this novel was the following sentence. A novel about a 14-year-old Confederate boy in the Civil War that switches sides. The plot, the characters, the setting, the names, the ebook, the audiobook, everything was generated in about an hour. Dreamed up by Silicon, using code written in Python that leverages currently available large language models. Was this the best novel you've ever read? Probably not. But was it good enough to blur the lines between genuine and insincere? I will leave you with the most real sentence contained in this work. This technology is already here. It will only get better. And it cannot be stopped. So we all better get used to it.